Tonight on the Joy Behar Show, the rampage at Fort Hood leaves us with a lot of questions, but not a lot of answers, such as what triggered this incident and could it have been averted? We'll try to shed a little light on the situation. Tonight I want to begin with the tragedy at Fort Hood, Texas. The man suspected of opening fire, killing 13 people, and injuring dozens more regained consciousness today and is now talking. But what set Major Hassan off is still the subject of a lot of speculation. Joining me now to discuss is Paul Rieckhoff, founder and executive director of Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, Zuhdi Jasser from the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, and former Navy officer. But first, let's go to Samantha Hayes, CNN correspondent who's on the scene. What's the latest, Samantha? Give us an update.
Joy, Major Hassan, as you mentioned, is awake, and apparently he's talking. And you also know that he was shot 4 times. He's being treated in a hospital in San Antonio, Texas. And staff members there tell us that he has been communicating with them, although an official hospital spokesperson would not tell us whether he has been communicating with investigators as well. Back here at Fort Hood in an afternoon press conference, Lieutenant General Robert Cohn, the Fort commander, talked about how he feels that in this tragedy they're moving on to a new phase. And he said part of that is for the Army to reevaluate itself, reevaluate its procedures to make sure that if there are other soldiers who are harboring the same kind of discontent that Major Hassan was, that they don't dismiss those indicators.
We are going to take a very hard look at ourselves and look at anything that might have been done to have prevented this. And I think what's really important is that Hassan was a soldier, and we have other soldiers that that might have some of the same stress and indicators that he has.
Cohn also talked about how there were really hundreds of people who were directly affected by the mass shooting on Thursday. Soldiers, of course, but also, many civilian workers who were there at the time, as well as medical professionals and law enforcement personnel, and that he felt that the soldiers, in some ways, he wasn't worried about as much because he said, they have had stress training, whereas many other civilians and other people who were affected by this do not. And he wanted to talk about how the Army is trying to make every possible service available to those folks in their recovery.
Zuhdi, let me ask you something. Would you say that Fort Hood is more like, after this incident, more like Columbine, where somebody goes berserk, or is it more like 9/11, where there is a planned terrorist attack involved?
Well, Joy, I think if this was an isolated incident, you'd be able to say that it's Columbine, but by no means is it isolated. We saw an attack on a National Guard post in Arkansas. We've seen a number of terrorist cells from radical Islamist sects come out of New Jersey, North Carolina. We've seen out of Dallas and Chicago, and there's been over 40 attacks prevented since 9/11, and the only thing all these attacks have in common, none of them really were communicating with one another. It's an ideology of radical form of a faith that I love, that has a political version that is militant, that is radicalized and hates Western society, that separates church and state and separates mosque and state, and it's a different type of Islam. I mean, this is the issue, is who's Islam or which Islam? The Islam I was taught and I love, my parents came here because we could celebrate and practice our faith more freely in America than in anywhere else in the world. The Islam Dr. Hassan ended up practicing is one that is truly an enemy within.
Well, what made him turn, do you think? Was it planned? What is your assessment of all of that? I mean, he seemed to be a well-respected Army psychiatrist and, saying a few things that were very iffy, I suppose, and then all of a sudden this happened. What do you think happened to him?
Well, I think we need to look at it as a slippery slope, where for example, the alcohol, let's say, if it's drug use, substance use ends up worsening him, and that toxin is a political ideology that hates the West, that hates America, and blames everything wrong with Muslims on a Western conspiracy theory, and he started to fall down that toxic ideology until he broke, and you saw that he was handing out Qurans, and we can't subscribe this to just being radical, just being a psychotic break. He had a political ideology. His imam that was teaching him just put out on the website pride about him. I mean, this is part of the Al-Qaeda narrative.
Yeah, that was Anwar al-Awlaki. who was an imam. Now he's in, is it Yemen? I believe he's in Yemen now.
Yeah, yep, he was.
Yes, and he's saying that he admires the man. Paul, let me ask you a question. Do you think the intelligence community, the CIA, I guess, and Army officials missed the whole radicalization that was going on with this guy?
It looks like they missed quite a few things, but we still don't know what. And I think that's an important point we have to emphasize right now. We can't jump to conclusions. We don't know enough about the relationships he has externally, the relationships he had within the military. You know, we've been urging everyone to just take a deep breath here and focus on the families at Fort Hood who really need the support of a nation right now. We can't rush to stereotyping soldiers. We can't rush to stereotyping Muslim Americans. We've really got to urge folks to really focus on the families and keep that caution before we jump to conclusions about what this guy's affiliations were, because most people just don't know right now.
Well, there were certain signs that he was, showing signs that he was radicalizing and against the country, and no one seemed to pick it up. Let me ask you something, Zuhdi. Was this incompetence, do you think, or political correctness that nobody came in and intercepted when this guy was showing signs of being anti-American?
Well, you know, our greatest asset and also our greatest liability in this conflict is this protection for religious freedom. And what's happening is, as much as I love it in order to practice my faith and my personal faith of Islam, the political Islam, which this guy was expressing, people probably felt they couldn't say anything about because he said things at presentations that were concerning, and officers thought they were going to be labeled as Islamophobes if they said anything about him. And I think it's time to set aside political correctness and say, you know what? There's a ideology no different than the Marxism that Lee Harvey Oswald practiced when he was in the Marines that we need to know about and follow and track, different from the personal faith of Islam that all of us need. And remember, one of the things I want to emphasize is that if we're going to win this war of ideas and stop this virus that's spreading, it's going to be Muslims, devotional, practicing Muslims that defeat this, and therefore we can't alienate our greatest asset in this battle.
A lot of people are saying that he was taunted as a Muslim. How do you think that played into his behavior, either one of you, Paul?
Well, it must have added to his stress. I mean, I think there's a lot of complex factors involved here. He was also a psychologist dealing with folks coming home. Psychiatrist.
A lot of training.
Yeah, and he's also experienced exposure to a lot of folks coming home with severe mental health injuries. So he's under a lot of stress in a lot of different areas. I'm by no means making excuses here, but I don't think we can look to one factor at this point in the investigation and say that's the cause of everything.
Yeah.
But the folks at hold on, sir. The folks at Fort Hood here have been through a lot. You've got folks going through a 4th deployment coming up from the 1st Cavalry Division, and you know, those repeated stresses being involved in this mental health community, that may be a factor too. We don't know. I think a lot of folks, like your other guests here, quite honestly, are jumping to a lot of conclusions. We don't know until the investigation runs its course.
Zuhdi,
at this point, we got to focus on.
Zuhdi, wait. Do you think that we should be monitoring mosques? Is that politically correct to do that, or what do you think about that?
Well, wait a minute. In this country, religious freedom is protected, and we have to be careful when we say monitoring mosques. I think that if the FBI or Homeland Security is following an individual and he happens to go into a mosque, it shouldn't be a sanctuary for him if they're following him into it. But remember, mosques are usually public places, so I really, in my mosque, I wouldn't have anything to hide, but, you know, I don't want our religious facilities to turn into basically places for quote-unquote monitoring, but the idea is if they're political, if they're advocating for the Islamic State or Sharia law, which is a threat to the West, a threat to the individual rights that we so much protect and the human rights, we need to acknowledge that. And I think one issue about what he was mentioning about harassment, if it's not harassment, individuals like Dr. Hassan are going to blame American foreign policy, they're going to blame Israel, the Jews, they're going to blame something. So I would be careful to say that, well, harassment led to his acting this way. Something he was going to find to allow him.
Stress-wise, though, there are only 408 psychiatrists in the Army, and they're serving 550,000 active duty troops around the world. That is really a pathetic number.
It is.
These guys are really suffering
the
from
amount of resources we've leaned against post-traumatic stress disorder and mental health issues is woefully inadequate.
Yes.
You know, as many as 1 in 3 folks are coming home from deployment with post-traumatic stress disorder, severe depression, and these folks, you know, separate from Major Hassan, are under tremendous pressure. And if there is a wake-up call that can come out of this, it's that we need more support for those troops and their families.
Okay, thank you very much to my panel. Back in a minute with the Queen of Southern Cuisine, Paula Dean.